Hello, my name is Taya Graham, and welcome to the Police Accountability Report. As I never get tired of saying, this show has a single purpose, holding police accountable. And today we're going to do so by delving deeper into a controversial no-knock warrant that led to the death of a young woman, and to reveal some of the critical details of the case the mainstream media has ignored. Then we're going to check in with a police auditor who has had yet another fraught encounter with police, which led to some questionable charges. But before I get started, I want you watching to know that if you have evidence of police misconduct, please email it to us privately at par@therealnews.com. And of course, you can message me directly at Taya's Baltimore on Facebook and Twitter. And please like, share, and comment on our videos. You know I read your comments and I appreciate them. Now that we have that out of the way, let's get started. Now, on our last show, we reported on the tragic case of Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor was a 26-year-old emergency medical technician, a frontline worker at 2 hospitals in Kentucky. Taylor was asleep in her Louisville, Kentucky home last month when police executed, according to a lawsuit filed by her family, a no-knock warrant. It was the last in a series of warrants Louisville police had served related to a drug investigation in which Taylor was not a suspect. Nevertheless, they used a battering ram to break down her door. According to Taylor's family, neither she nor her boyfriend Walker heard police announce themselves. After the plainclothes unit busted down the door, Walker fired a single shot, striking the Louisville police officer, Sergeant John Mattingly. Several officers on the scene returned fire, unloading roughly 24 rounds and striking Taylor 8 times, killing her almost instantly. Since then, the raid and killing of Taylor has raised serious questions about the use of no-knock warrants. And this week, Louisville prosecutor Thomas B. Wine asked a judge to drop the charges against Walker, who had been charged with attempted murder. In a video press conference, Wine said that he believed neither party had committed a crime, that the killing of Taylor was simply a matter of miscommunication. Let's listen.
But sometimes when you look at it and you think what separated these two parties was a door, and it's very possible that there was no criminal activity on either side of that door because people couldn't hear what the other party was saying.
But along with the statement, Wine released audio recordings made by Walker and one of the officers who shot Taylor. And it is the details of both pieces of evidence which we're going to focus on now. That's because there are details of the case that the mainstream media missed and could shed a critical light on the case. To discuss the evidence, I'm joined by my reporting partner, Stephen Janis. Stephen, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Now, Stephen, you analyzed the recordings. What did you learn?
Well, there's entirely different stories based upon this raid, which came from the recordings of interviews with Walker and with the police officer who was shot just after the shooting occurred. And what I think is most distinct is the timeline, how much time the police spent outside their door. The police talk about spending 45 seconds to a minute outside the door versus Walker's story where he said they barely had time to put on something like pajamas and get out of the hallway, they didn't have time to get to the door.
First thing she said was, "Who is it?" No response. So we like, what the heck? We both get up, start putting on clothes. Another knock at the door. She's like, "Who is it?" Loud at the top of her lungs. No response. So I'm like, what the heck? So then I grab my gun, which is legal, like I'm licensed to carry everything. I've never even fired my gun outside of a range. I'm scared to death. So she says that there's another knock at the door. She's yelling at the top of her lungs, and I am too at this point. Who is it? No answer, no response, no anything. So we like, what the heck? We both just see what I have on. But when we get out of the bed or whatever, like walking towards the door, the door comes off the hinges. So I just let off one shot. I still can't see who it is or anything. So now the door's flying open. I have one shot, and then all of a sudden there's a whole lot of shots. And we both just dropped to the ground, and the gun fell right over there. And I kicked it because I'm scared to death. Now we're seeing lights and stuff. So it's looking like, okay, it's the police, and there's a lot of yelling and stuff. So there's just shooting, we're both on the ground, and then when all the shots stop, I'm panicking. She's right there on the ground, bleeding, and yeah.
Banged on the door, no response. Banged on it again, no response. At that point, we started announcing ourselves, please come to the door. Please, we have a search warrant. And we banged. I probably banged on the door six or seven different time periods. Not 6 or 7 times, but 6 or 7 different times, which seems like an eternity when you're up at a door waiting. It probably lasted between 45 seconds and a minute.
So there's this great discrepancy. And what I think is interesting is I remember watching a trial one time as a reporter where a witness described standing outside a minute, watching a fight that went on for a minute. And the lawyer in the case said, well, why don't you count out what a minute is like? And he went 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's the same thing. It seems to me highly unlikely if you're serving a no-knock warrant that you're going to be standing out there for a minute. It seems much more likely the story of Walker holds weight, where they barely had time to get in the hallway. So those conflicts between those two stories really stands out in contrast.
But Stephen, there was also something striking in the visual that Wine put up on the screen, which showed how the officers planned the raid. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, what's really interesting is that he showed a whiteboard that these task force, I guess, had used to plan out these raids, and it showed that there were already 2 other no-knock warrants that had been served that evening. And we just found out that the reason that they came to her home, Breonna Taylor's home, is because she had had a previous relationship with the only suspect that's been arrested in this case. But it did show that they've actually executed other no-knock warrants, so they were doing this risky behavior over and over again. And what the prosecutor used it to do was to demonstrate that they had said they weren't going to do a no-knock warrant in this house, but of course they'd already executed at least 1, if not 2 more. So it just shows how dangerous this entire investigation was.
So finally, there was an interesting moment in the press conference when Wine talked about how no one's life is worth any amount of heroin, but it raised an important question. Exactly what was this case? What was the underlying crime that warranted 3 raids?
It's really interesting because it took me a while to get some information on what happened. There was one suspect arrested, which is now a district court case, for trafficking in some heroin and some synthetic drugs, which I don't know what that means. I guess it could be, benzodiazepine. But it's clear, because I said, what was the quantity? How much heroin were you going after? What was this big drug conspiracy? And they didn't have an answer. The prosecutor themselves don't seem to know what this was about. So when you think about it, you have a woman dead, a man charged with murder, a police officer shot, and the question is, over what? This is the existential question in American policing. Over what?
So it's clear there are many questions regarding the death of Breonna that remain unanswered. But there's one thing we know. She is another innocent victim, a casualty of the war on drugs. Perhaps that's why the Louisville prosecutor made the comment comparing the value of a life to a stash of illicit narcotics. As the New York Times reported, between 2010 and 2016, 81 civilians were killed during what's known as dynamic raids. Not just no-knock, but raids where the police announced themselves and quickly broke down the door. Since nearly 88% of all police raids are related to narcotics, according to the same article, it's clear the toll of the war on drugs is real and substantial. But that troubling tally leads to a question. If halting the spread of illicit drugs is such a pressing priority, why did police ignore the mass distribution of large quantities of opioids into communities across the country by pharmaceutical companies? As has been well documented by investigative news organizations like ProPublica, billions of opioid pills flooded communities suffering from rising overdose deaths. Executives were actually aware that the onslaught of pain pills was causing a serious addiction crisis across the country. Granted, the sales were technically legal. However, when the Justice Department and DEA became alarmed at the quantity and divergence of this massive influx of pills, they backed off prosecuting the drug companies despite the aforementioned emails, later revealing executives knew the flood of pills were wreaking havoc on the health and well-being of our citizens. Apparently, no-knock warrants don't apply to CEOs and profitable corporations. But from our reporting, we do know one situation where police apparently don't hesitate to use the power to arrest and detain. I'm talking about our ongoing dialogue with cop watchers and auditors working across the country who are holding police accountable through citizen journalism and self-produced YouTube videos. Earlier this year, we spoke to an auditor in Oregon named Kenneth Dunham. He recounted how he was arrested for filming the exterior of a police station in Pendleton, Oregon. Since then, his case was tossed, but last week we learned that he has been charged again. Here to talk about it is Kenneth Dunham. Kenneth, thank you so much for joining us today.
So, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So tell us, what were you filming when you were told you were under arrest for jaywalking and interfering with a police officer? Tell us what we're seeing in the video.
I had been driving around earlier that night, just filming incidents involving the police. and my wife was driving me around, and they pulled us over, and because they were upset with us following them from scene to scene, and because of that, I went to go make a complaint. I knew it was shift change, so I went straight to the police department and asked to see a supervisor, and they instead gave me attitude, started yelling at me from the building, wouldn't come down and say nothing, started yelling at me and telling me that I was subject to arrest, and that didn't sit well. So I told them that I wanted to speak to somebody.
Okay, first, do you have ID with you?
No, I don't.
Okay. You need to provide ID.
No, Oregon statute says I don't have to provide ID unless I'm being arrested. Are you arresting me?
You're being detained
Okay.
for jaywalking.
Is there a crosswalk within 100 feet of here?
Yeah, there's one right down
Yeah,
there.
that one that I used down there, yeah.
No, I watched you walk right across here.
Yeah, I can walk right across here.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, arrest me then for jaywalking.
So they had a supervisor come out, pull across the street, and he sat there. And while he was sitting there, one of the cars veered and tried to hit me, one of the cops, with his car. And I got that on video too, and that upset me. And I went to the officer that was sitting across the street that seen it all, the supervisor, and I asked him if I could ask him a question. And he said, yeah. And I went across the street and I asked him, are you guys just going to let this guy try to hit me with his car and get away with that? And he of course started explaining that from his vantage point, he didn't see it that way, and that he believes that I was never in any danger, and that should be good enough. And so I just laughed and I walked away and I walked back across the street. So I'm not sure if they arrested me for walking across the street to talk to him or walking across the street after I was done talking to him, but that's what they arrested me for.
Now, as soon as they told you you were detained, you gave your identification as per Oregon law. Why do you think the officers decided to go ahead and press charges?
Well, what they did to me, they put me in the back of the car and they told me that I was being arrested for interfering with the police investigation and for jaywalking, is what he kept saying. And I don't think there's a jaywalking law. I haven't found what they actually ended up charging me with was failure to use a crosswalk and pedestrian on the highway.
How many officers and police cars arrived on the scene, and how long were you detained?
So initially, there was only a couple of officers there, and then out of nowhere, they opened the gates and they started to. You can see in the video that they surrounded me, and I try to approach, especially like when I'm doing video like that, like I kind of take myself out of it and think of it like watching wildlife, and that was what it was. It was a straight intimidation factor. They were circling up on me and trying to get me to freak out and act some kind of way.
They cut your clothing off, damaging your clothes and the harness rig you used for your GoPro camera. What other tactics did they use that you felt were intimidation? Wasn't there a very unusual threat you received from the cop?
There was two things that happened that were very unusual to me. The first thing was when they were cutting my harness off. I don't know if everybody's familiar with the way a GoPro harness works, but it snaps on like this, and then there's bungee straps behind you. So the cop went behind me to cut it, and when he did, he had his knife in his hand, and I said something about it, and he made sure to point the knife straight, not in a cutting motion, but straight, like he made sure that I knew that he could stick me, and I was handcuffed, and he was basically said that he whispered in my ear, not working out the way you thought it did it, or something like that. There was something odd they'd said there. And then the second time, and that kind of set me off a little bit PTSD wise, just because of my issues with the cops in the past. And then the second thing was, it's the weirdest it's the weirdest, most peculiar threat I've ever had. He told me, he kept rubbing my belly. I'm a big guy, and he kept rubbing my belly like a Buddha, like this. I told him, don't touch me, man, because I was in handcuffs in the back of a cop car. And then he started patting my stomach. And he says, every time I see you, I'm going to make sure that I run up your heart rate. I'm going to make sure that I exert as much energy from you as I can so that your arteries clog and so that you end up dying of heart failure. Every time I see you, I'm going to do this exact same thing. And then he called me a fat boy and he shut the door and left.
Do you think the police were taking the COVID-19 social distancing regulations seriously? This seems like a very minor arrest to potentially expose someone to the virus.
I know you'd asked me how many cops there were earlier. Because of the excitement, I'm going to say I want to be a conservative estimate is probably a dozen of them, but realistically, there was probably 18, 20 of them. And I'm going to say a third of them were masked up. I wasn't masked up at the time. Um, uh, and, I probably should have been, but I wasn't masked up at the time. But neither were most of the cops there. And you can see in my video, most of them are face to face.
Both the cases we covered today illustrate a stark contrast. It's a distinction between what policing purports to be and what it actually does. It's a divide that actually applies to an underlying principle of journalism: show, don't tell. So in both cases, the contrast is clear because we can see it. Let's remember that the decision to ask a judge to drop the charges against Walker came only after the family of Breonna Taylor filed a lawsuit, and only after intense media scrutiny of the circumstances surrounding her death did prosecutors act. In fact, in his statement, Wine said police officers omitted details that may have prevented Walker's indictment when they testified in front of the grand jury. The point is that while policing in general is categorized as public safety, the political economy that drives it gets less attention. And it's that relationship between policing and profit that needs a full and detailed reckoning. Think about it. As we could see in the whiteboard shared during Wine's press conference, police were willing to execute multiple no-knock warrants throughout the city to confiscate an unknown quantity of drugs. All the money, overtime, court time, and resources targeting a drug enterprise that to this day remains unknown in both breadth and scope, or at least prosecutors wouldn't tell us. But what we do know is how many opioid pills flooded the country. Billions. In fact, the data released by the DEA can be viewed online. You can actually search to see how many pills were shipped in your community by searching this Washington Post website we're showing you on the screen. But despite the fact the DEA was the agency that tracked this data, the nation's drug warriors apparently were otherwise occupied. Instead, they and other local drug units were breaking down the doors of the poor and disenfranchised, comparatively small-time drug dealers, and yes, the home of Breonna Taylor. But of course, part of the process of reporting is taking the general and boiling it down to the particular. That is, examining the broader issues within the purview of a single life. Last week, it was the story of Lawrence Christian, the man who was tossed out of his home after a drug unit stormed into his home and arrested him for a crime he didn't commit. The false charges left him homeless, and since then, he has disappeared. But this week, we're going to look at an act not of commission, but omission. That is a failure to act. It's the story of a woman named Taya McClary, the tale of a mother who died a horrible death, but whose case was ignored as her family suffered. Taya was found buried under a pile of mulch, partially disrobed with a bag tied around her ankles. Police said publicly she died of an overdose, but when Stephen and I reviewed her autopsy report, we discovered something odd. Despite what police said, the medical examiner found her thyroid and adrenal glands had ruptured, a sign that she might have been strangled, evidence police ignored, despite the pleas of her daughter. Let's listen.
It clearly looks like a homicide. It smells like a homicide. Like, why wouldn't it be investigated as such?
And so to this day, her case remains unsolved. Her death, if it indeed was at the hands of another, was just a statistic in a file folder, buried and forgotten. And yet her family is still in pain, and her possible killer still at large. What better example could we show that illustrates the challenges facing policing, not just in our city, but across the country? An institution that does not have the wherewithal to pursue the most heinous crime we can imagine, but the persistence to storm into people's houses unannounced. It's a contrast of priorities that needs to be questioned, not only so we don't forget victims like Breonna Taylor, a medical technician who aspired to be a nurse, or Taya McClary, a loving mother and sister, but also so that the root causes of these troubling contradictions are brought into light, into full view, so that all of us can have a say in what type of policing we want, both now and in the future. I want to thank my guest, Kenneth Dunham, for joining me today. Kenneth, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And you guys are awesome. You guys, every time I put up a video and something like this happens, you guys have always been there for me. And that's great because everybody that watches, you're there for them too.
And I want to thank my colleague, Stephen Janis, for his investigative reporting, writing, and editing on this piece. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks for having me, Taya. Appreciate it.
And of course, I have to thank friend of the show, Noli D, for her support. Thank you, Noli D. And I want you watching to know that if you have evidence of police misconduct or brutality, please share it with us, and we might be able to investigate. Please reach out to us. You can email us tips privately at par@therealnews.com and share your evidence of police misconduct. You can also message us at Police Accountability Report on Facebook or Instagram, or at Eyes on Police on Twitter. And of course, you can message me directly at Taya's Baltimore on Twitter or Facebook. And please like and comment. You know I read your comments, appreciate them, and answer your questions whenever I can. My name is Taya Graham. Thank you for joining me for this Police Accountability Report. Please be safe out there.